they didn't fall in love with you on purpose. That's the part nobody ever truly admits. Because if love were intentional, it would be controllable. And if it were controllable, it wouldn't unsettle them the way you do. But here's what's actually true. You were never supposed to matter this much. At first, you were simply a distraction, a fleeting curiosity, something light, something manageable. You were supposed to be temporary, like a melody that no longer lingers after it fades. And yet, something shifted. Or maybe everything aligned too perfectly. Because slowly, so gradually, they didn't even notice when it stopped being casual. Your voice stayed with them longer than it should have. Your absence felt heavier than any logic could justify. Your presence began to rearrange the interior of their emotional world. And this is where things start to become genuinely complicated. Because when someone recognizes they're feeling more than they intended, the instinct isn't to move closer, it's to pull back. Not because they don't care, but because they care in a way that threatens the identity they've spent years carefully constructing just to survive. Most people never recognize this. They interpret distance as disinterest. They translate silence as indifference. But sometimes, silence is what surfaces when someone is completely overwhelmed by something they never prepared for. Something like you. And that's where the contradiction begins to grow. What you're about to encounter in this exploration isn't simply an explanation of why someone might withdraw when they begin feeling deeply. It goes further than that. It reaches into the psychological landscape beneath that behavior, into why the very depth of what someone feels can become the source of their retreat, into why the most powerful emotions are often the ones most vigorously denied. If you are still watching this, you are already part of the rare few who are willing to face what most people spend their entire lives running from. 97% of people scroll past content like this, not because it does not reach them, but because it reaches them too deeply. If this is already moving something inside you, subscribe to Carl Jung Psychology right now and turn on notifications. What you are about to hear doesn't just explain why people pull away when love becomes real. It will permanently change how you see yourself. Because on the surface, they appear composed, controlled, entirely detached. But beneath that exterior, something is quietly coming undone. You stirred something they had buried. Not simply attraction, not just warmth. Something older, something deeper. Something they spent years persuading themselves they no longer required. And now it's awake. And this is where it becomes psychologically fascinating. Carl Jung spent decades exploring what happens when the unconscious confronts something the conscious mind has refused to acknowledge. He observed that the strongest emotional responses, the ones that surface without invitation and resist all attempts at suppression, tend to be the ones connected to what we've denied in ourselves. What you activated in them wasn't simply feeling. It may have been recognition. The subconscious meeting something it had been waiting for without ever consciously admitting it was searching. But here's the part that should give you genuine pause. They didn't consciously choose you. You bypassed their reasoning. You moved past their defenses. You arrived somewhere in the subconscious where decisions don't get made so much as they emerge. And when something like love begins in that territory, it doesn't request permission. It doesn't negotiate with logic. It doesn't concern itself with timing or consequences. It simply grows, quietly, persistently, in ways that resist containment. And they sensed it. But rather than moving toward it, they began questioning it. Why this person? Why now? Why does this feel unlike anything before? And beneath those questions, something more unsettling started to take shape. This is something I may not be able to contain. And this is where fear begins to direct things. Because love, genuine love, the kind that fundamentally restructures the emotional interior, isn't soft. It's invasive. It arrives without announcement. It reorganizes what you care about. It exposes needs you preferred not to acknowledge. And above everything else, it creates a kind of vulnerability that can't be anticipated or managed in advance. So what tends to happen when that arrives? They don't yield to it. They resist. They suppress. They generate distance from the very thing drawing them forward, because the subconscious doesn't prioritize comfort. But the ego does. And their ego began signaling something urgent. This is too much. This is moving too quickly. This is too real. So they did what they've always done when something feels destabilizing. They tried to manage it. They withdrew just enough to feel steady again. They constructed space. Not because they didn't want you, but because wanting you had started to feel like dissolving themselves. And here's the part that tends to change the entire picture. The more they attempted to suppress it, the more powerful it became. Because suppressed emotions don't simply disappear, they transform. They intensify in the dark. They become more consuming, more concentrated, more insistent. And gradually, you weren't simply someone they were fond of. You had become someone they couldn't stop returning to, even in thought, even in the space between other thoughts, especially in your absence. Because when you're not there, there's nothing left to redirect their attention from what they feel. No exchange to soften it. No proximity to regulate it. Just stillness. And in that stillness, the truth tends to get considerably louder. And this is where things begin to spiral internally. Because now they're caught between two forces that refuse to coexist peacefully. What they feel and what they're afraid to acknowledge. And those forces don't settle into quiet coexistence. They collide. They generate tension. They produce confusion. They create patterns of behavior that make no logical sense from the outside. Present and then distant. Warm and then unreachable. Engaged, then suddenly absent. And you're left asking, what changed? But here's the uncomfortable answer. Nothing changed. It simply became real. And reality is far more difficult to navigate than the space before definition. Because when things were light, when nothing had been named, when everything still felt manageable, there was still a sense of control. But now it carries weight. Now it carries implications. Now it holds the capacity to alter things in ways they cannot fully anticipate. And that erosion of predictability creates something that tends to feel genuinely threatening to someone who has organized their entire emotional life around staying composed. So they do something that appears entirely contradictory. They begin creating distance while feeling closer than they've ever been. They hesitate while thinking about you without interruption. They withdraw while something inside them moves toward you at a depth they don't fully comprehend. And you can feel it. You can sense that something is unfolding beneath the visible surface. Something unspoken. Something they may not even fully understand within themselves. But here's where it becomes even more layered. Because part of them already knows, not consciously, but instinctively. They sense that this isn't ordinary. They understand, somewhere beneath logic, that if they allow this to fully develop, it will reshape them. Not in a passing way, in a lasting way. And that recognition is where the genuine conflict begins to take root. Because now it's no longer simply about feelings. It's about identity. About who they are, who they've convinced themselves they need to remain, and whether there's space in that architecture for something this intense, this unpredictable, something like you. And this is where the internal tension approaches something close to a threshold. Because they're no longer asking, do I feel something for this person? They're asking something far more destabilizing. What happens to who I am if I allow this to continue? And that's the question they're trying most urgently not to answer. Because somewhere beneath everything, they may already sense the truth. But acknowledging it would mean they're already further in than they intended. They told themselves it was nothing. Chemistry, circumstance, a temporary phase that would dissolve with enough separation. But here's what tends to unfold. Distance didn't diminish it. Distance clarified it. Because when you remove the person, you remove the distractions. And what remains isn't lighter, it's unfiltered, unavoidable, exposed. And this is where things become genuinely complex. Because now they're not responding to you, they're responding to what you awakened within them. And that is something they can't escape simply by changing their surroundings. Most people never see this dimension of it. They assume that longing is always about the person. But missing someone in this particular way tends to be about what that person uncovered in them. Because you didn't simply arrive in their life, you illuminated parts of it they had sealed away so thoroughly they had nearly forgotten those parts were still there. Needs buried beneath the appearance of independence. Vulnerabilities concealed behind composure. Desires they convinced themselves were no longer relevant. And suddenly, all of it is conscious again, demanding acknowledgement, demanding presence, demanding a form of honesty they've spent years carefully avoiding. Because honesty would require admitting something they've worked to deny, that they feel more deeply than they allow. that they need more than they project, that genuine connection matters to them far more than they've ever been willing to say. And now you've become the surface that reflects that truth back. But here's something they'll rarely articulate. That reflection tends to unsettle them more than the prospect of losing you. Because losing you is external. Facing themselves is something else entirely. That's internal, permanent, inescapable. So they do what tends to happen when the subconscious feels cornered. They rationalize. This isn't realistic. This can't work. This is too complicated. But those thoughts aren't truth. They're architecture. Protective structures that logic tends to build when emotion feels unmanageable. And right now, their emotions feel like something beyond their capacity to regulate. And this is where the contradiction deepens further. Because while they're telling themselves to release it, they're emotionally holding on with more intensity than before. While they're attempting to construct separation, they're replaying moments with you on an internal loop. Your words, your presence, the particular way you made them feel genuinely seen without requiring anything in return. And that last piece, that's what may have disrupted the entire structure. Because you didn't pursue relentlessly. You didn't manufacture urgency. You simply existed in a way that felt authentic. And authenticity, genuine, unperformed authenticity, is extraordinarily rare. So rare that when someone encounters it, they don't always receive it as something safe. They tend to experience it as something powerful. And power, particularly the kind that lives in emotion, tends to feel threatening to someone whose primary orientation has been toward maintaining control. So they begin doing something subtle but corrosive. They fracture their perception of you. One part sees everything they've been searching for. Another part perceives you as a threat to the stability they've carefully assembled. And those two perceptions can't occupy the same space without generating tension. So what tends to emerge is oscillation, drawn in, then pulling away. Not because their feelings shifted, but because fear closed the distance between them and what they feel. And fear has a way of being remarkably persuasive. It offers things that sound like clarity. It suggests that withdrawal is self-awareness, that detachment is wisdom, that releasing you is a form of protection. But here's what tends to remain true beneath all of that. You're no longer simply a person to them. You've become a psychological disruption, a shift in interior structure, a challenge to everything they believed they understood about who they are. And disruptions don't simply get dismissed. They get processed. They get resisted. They get absorbed. And that absorption is where things tend to fracture further. Because now they're not just thinking about you, they're measuring themselves against the experience of you, asking questions they've never had to ask before. Why did this reach me so completely? Why does moving forward feel like moving against something? Why does this feel like something I shouldn't release and yet can't fully receive? And those questions don't have easy answers, because the answers require vulnerability, and vulnerability requires a form of yielding. And yielding tends to feel like losing the grip. So they resist again, and each time it carries a slightly higher cost. because now they're aware. Aware that what they feel isn't surface level. Aware that this doesn't simply replicate with someone else. Aware that you reached something in them that doesn't often get reached. And that awareness creates a kind of compression, internal pressure that doesn't release outward but tightens inward, making everything feel more weighted, more significant, more unresolvable. And yet they still hesitate, still analyze, still attempt to find a way to contain something that was never designed to fit inside a container. And here's where things tend to surface in ways beyond their control. Because the more they suppress what they feel, the more it tends to leak into areas they can't manage, into their energy, into their mood, into those quiet moments where an unexplained emptiness settles in without clear cause. Because that emptiness isn't random. It carries the shape of what they're refusing to name. You. Something to consider before we go further. What number surfaces for you when you sit with something you felt but refused to fully acknowledge? Whether it's 11, 777, or 520, leave it in the comments. Numbers we feel drawn to in reflective moments can sometimes reflect where we actually are, even when we can't put it into words. What comes to mind? And this is where something unmistakable begins to form, even if it remains unspoken. They're not uncertain about their feelings. They're conflicted about what those feelings would require of them. Because opening to you doesn't only mean connection, it means transformation. It means risk. It means stepping outside the emotional patterns that have served as protection, even when those same patterns have also kept them fundamentally isolated. And that becomes the genuine dilemma: remain protected or feel something real. Maintain the familiar architecture or allow something that might permanently reshape who they are. And this tends to be the point where most people arrive at a decision, though rarely one made from truth. It tends to emerge from fear. And when fear makes the choice, it doesn't reach for what carries meaning. It reaches for what carries familiarity. Even when familiarity means a particular kind of quiet emptiness. Even when familiarity means regret that accumulates gradually, without announcement, without ceremony. And deep within, they can sense that possibility beginning to form, that unsettling awareness that stepping away might not bring the relief they anticipated. It might bring something far more persistent. Something that follows them into the textures of ordinary days. Something that stays. And this tends to be the thought they keep suppressing, the one that surfaces in the late hours when everything is still. What if this is something I'll never encounter again? And they have no answer, because answering it would require confronting a truth they're still circling away from. That perhaps in ways they weren't entirely prepared to acknowledge, they had already arrived somewhere they couldn't simply step back from. And stepping away doesn't dissolve what they feel. It may only drive it further inward. And what lives inward doesn't tend to disappear quietly. It waits, it develops, it resurfaces in moments least expected. And somewhere in the depths of their awareness, they may already sense this. But sensing something and being willing to sit with it remain very different acts. They believed that suppression would bring a kind of quiet. Instead, it generated a low and persistent frequency, something that follows them into every solitary moment. Because repression doesn't dissolve emotion, it tends to displace it into spaces where it no longer makes rational sense, but still insists on being felt. And this is where the experience shifts from something like longing into something closer to fragmentation. One part reaching forward, another part holding back, not with visible conflict, not dramatically, but in ways that become increasingly difficult to dismiss. In the way your presence crosses their mind at unexpected moments. In the way silence begins to carry a weight it didn't carry before. In the way other connections suddenly feel insufficient, not as a comparison, but as a recognition. You activated something specific, something that doesn't tend to transfer to a different context. And now, everything else carries the feeling of something diluted, a diminished version of something they can't seem to recreate elsewhere. But here's what they tend to resist acknowledging. It isn't that no one else measures up. It's that no one else is you. And that realization doesn't bring comfort. It tends to create a kind of entrapment, because now they're attempting to move past someone who changed the interior landscape of who they are. And you can't truly move past what reshaped you. You can only behave as though it didn't occur. And that behavior requires energy. Constant, quietly exhausting energy that accumulates without ever producing resolution. So they stay occupied. They fill their hours with motion and noise, with people and tasks, and anything that prevents them from remaining too long in stillness. Because stillness is where everything tends to return, not gradually, not gently, but with a sudden and unexpected completeness. Moments, sensations, exchanges that were never fully closed. And this is where something aches in a way they didn't anticipate. Because before you, they understood how to protect themselves. They had structures, distances, emotional architecture that kept things contained and predictable. But you moved through those structures. You reached past the system. You allowed them to feel something without any forewarning. And now those familiar defenses don't function quite the same way, which means they're exposed, not to you anymore, but to themselves. And this is where the internal resistance begins to carry genuine consequence. Because what has been suppressed doesn't stay quiet indefinitely. It tends to surface in indirect expressions, in irritability without apparent cause, in restlessness that won't settle, in a quiet dissatisfaction that persists even when external circumstances appear entirely stable. Because something is absent, something they won't name but feel continuously. And slowly, that resistance begins to accumulate a different kind of weight, something resembling regret. Not immediate, not announced. Gradual, building in the background of their daily awareness, because they begin to recognize something they didn't anticipate. Stepping away didn't release them. It may have anchored them to the question of what if? And what if tends to be one of the most burdensome places the mind can inhabit, because it holds no closure, no resolution. Only possibilities that can no longer be explored. What if I had stayed? What if I had allowed myself to feel it without resistance? What if this was real and I turned away regardless? And those questions don't tend to soften with time. They tend to deepen. And this is where the psychological weight becomes something genuinely difficult to carry. Because now it's not simply feelings they're managing, it's unresolved meaning. And meaning, when left unresolved, tends to press for attention precisely when it's being ignored. So they begin to notice something that unsettles them. You don't seem to be leaving their mind. Time moves, days, weeks, perhaps longer. But the imprint persists, not constantly, but recurrently. And recurrence signals something that's become embedded. And what becomes embedded doesn't tend to release on command. And here's where the narrative they constructed begins to show its fractures. The version that said this was temporary. The version that said this was replaceable. The version that said life would simply return to how it was before. Because that version of normal no longer exists in quite the same form. Not after you. And that recognition doesn't arrive as a single moment of clarity. It accumulates, until one day it simply can't be dismissed. They sense it in moments that should feel complete, but carry an inexplicable absence. They notice it in conversations that should feel substantial, but somehow don't reach a depth they now recognize. They feel it in connections that should be enough, but fall short of something they can't fully name. And gradually, it stops being about missing you. It becomes about missing the version of themselves that existed alongside you. The version that felt present, open, genuinely alive in a way that hadn't surfaced before. And that may be the part that reaches them most deeply. Because losing you didn't only mean the absence of a person. It may have meant losing access to a dimension of themselves. And now they're not entirely certain how to find their way back to it. And this is where something close to unbearable begins to settle in. Because they're facing a reality that doesn't respond to distraction. They didn't simply lose you. They may have surrendered something within themselves, something that only emerged because of you. And the question stops being, do I miss this person? It becomes something far more penetrating. What part of myself did I release when I walked away? And there's no easy answer to that, because the answer leads inward, toward fear, toward the patterns of avoidance, toward the moment they chose safety over truth. And recognizing that introduces a fracture in the story they carry about themselves. The story that stepping away was the reasonable choice. The story that this wasn't as significant as it felt. The story that everything would settle in time. Because something within them recognizes it hasn't quite settled. And that awareness continues to build, pressing until there's no longer quite enough space to avoid it, no distraction powerful enough to silence it, no logic persuasive enough to dismantle it. Just one quiet, unavoidable recognition forming beneath everything else. They didn't simply encounter something rare, they moved away from it. And now they carry that. At some point, the resistance stops feeling like protection. It starts to feel like loss. Not the kind of loss that announces itself, not the kind visible from the outside. The kind that seeps quietly into ordinary moments until it's simply present everywhere. Because here's what tends to surface as the truth they can no longer outpace. They didn't protect themselves. They may have abandoned something genuine. And that recognition is no longer subtle. It surfaces in exchanges that feel incomplete. It resonates in moments of laughter that don't quite carry the depth they once reached. Something has shifted in a way that resists reversal. And this is where it becomes genuinely difficult. because now they're not asking whether they made the right choice. They're asking something that cuts far deeper. Why did I choose fear over something that felt this real? And there's no comfortable answer to that, because the answer exposes the architecture beneath everything, the defenses, the patterns, the mechanisms assembled to protect against vulnerability that may have ultimately kept them from genuine connection as well. And this is where the constructed narrative begins to give way entirely, because they can no longer maintain the position that this was ordinary. They can no longer reduce what they experienced into something containable. They can no longer convince themselves you were simply another passing presence. Because if you had been, you wouldn't still occupy this much interior space. Not physically, but psychologically, emotionally, in ways that resist removal. And that's what tends to move through every defense that's been constructed. Because defenses are built for threats. But you were never a threat. You were an invitation. And they chose not to accept it. Not because it lacked meaning, but because it carried too much. And now they inhabit a reality where that invitation has closed. And this is where something final tends to settle within them. Because what was suppressed doesn't simply return as it was. It returns with a clarity that strips away the protective layering piece by piece. And suddenly, everything is more visible than it's been. The moments they minimized, the feelings they dismissed, the connection they refused to trust. All of it now perceived with a sharpness that comes only with distance. And in that distance, truth becomes unmistakable. And the truth may feel something like this: they loved you. Not in a measured or convenient way, but in a way that disrupted them, altered them, and revealed them to themselves. And they moved away from it. And this is where what they carry becomes something genuinely lasting. Because now they understand something that doesn't come undone. These particular kinds of openings don't present themselves without limit. You can't reconstruct the exact moment when everything was still possible. Life continues moving, and sometimes it moves beyond the point where anything can be rebuilt. And that's the part that tends to stay the longest. Not simply your absence, but the recognition of what you were, what you offered without force, without manufactured urgency, without anything that wasn't real, simply real. And real is rare, so rare that recognition often arrives only after the departure. And now it's visible, completely and without the possibility of retreat. And this is where the internal shift completes itself, not dramatically, not outwardly, but in a way that becomes woven into how they move through everything that follows. Because now they carry something that resists resolution, a truth that can't be changed, a clarity that arrived after the opening had already closed. And this is the final contradiction they tend to carry forward. They didn't intend to love you this deeply, but they did. And now it's no longer possible to love you in the way they might have. And that too late isn't simply about timing. It's about the accumulation of every choice made from fear rather than truth. Each moment of chosen distance, each suppressed acknowledgement, each decision that moved away from vulnerability instead of toward it. All of it tends to lead here, to a place where understanding exists, but the possibility for action no longer does. And that may be what makes it so persistent, because understanding without the capacity to act carries its own particular weight. It means comprehending exactly what something meant with no way to return and honor that meaning. It means perceiving the depth after you've already moved away from it. And that comprehension doesn't tend to soften. It integrates. It becomes part of how they see everything that comes after, because now they carry the awareness of what they released. Not in vague terms, but specifically. They know what it felt like. They know what it might have become. They know what they chose not to remain for. And that knowledge doesn't remain quiet. It shapes them. It influences how they approach what follows. It tends to make them more deliberate, though sometimes more haunted, because every genuine connection they encounter after you will tend to be measured, consciously or not, against the one they didn't allow themselves to fully inhabit. That comparison won't always be fair, but it may always be present. Because something like you doesn't simply dissolve. It tends to become a reference point, a psychological imprint, a kind of standard that was established without anyone intending to set it. And this is the final truth they're pressed toward. They didn't lose you because something was wrong. They lost you because they weren't ready. And readiness doesn't hold its offer indefinitely. It arrives. It extends something.